Welcome to the Neo Model Railway. Stick around because in this episode I paint my board and I install point motors. The first thing I want to do is get some brown onto the baseboard. I have purchased some very inexpensive acrylic paints. I'm going to put that on the board as a kind of base layer so all of the scenic elements will sit on top, and if anything does happen to peek through, at least we have a kind of earth tone as our core colour. So it's back to art school for me. I'm going to mix together the red and the green in order to create that kind of brown effect. I might add a touch of yellow if it needs it, just to change that tone, but I think these are going to be too light. So a little smidge of black should give me the colour I'm looking for. It doesn't need to be perfect, it is just a base colour after all. Alternatively, I could just use brown and add a bit of black to it. I'm going to grab a decent paintbrush, a small tin to mix the paint in, and of course I need to lay some paper on the table to make sure I don't ruin my wife's lovely tablecloth. But before I continue, I just want to say thank you. I have been absolutely overwhelmed by the sheer positivity and support of the Model Railway community. So many of you have been posting lovely comments, giving me tips and hints, things I shouldn't be doing, things I could be doing differently, and in some cases, a whole plethora of really useful information. So just to name a few, thank you Andrew Duff, Gamer Druid, Dillington Model Railway, Paul Smith. There will be more of you. I'm not going to list everyone right now because I record these ahead of time, but thank you so much. I want to give a special shout out to the railway mechanical engineer. Wow, that person definitely seems to know their stuff. A huge amount of information, lots of books, lots of references. I've got my work cut out, that's for sure. And then last but not least, a little bit of a brag, a couple of channels commenting as well. The Piccadilly Model Railway, I love your work. I'm one of your subscribers, so thank you. And Hilton from Proper Chuffed, who gave me a channel shout out, which I just thought was amazing. So amazing. I love this community, so thank you very much. Right, enough of this sentimentality. I've got a board to paint. While the paint on the baseboard is drying, I want to take a few moments to talk about point motors. On this layout, I'm not going to be putting on any active signals. If I do have any, they will literally just be static. So I don't need to worry about point motors, which will allow me to switch coloured signals or lit signals on and off. With that in mind, I have picked up 5 of these PM2 point motors by Gaugemaster. The reason I've gone for these is because they seem relatively easy to use. They have quite a shallow profile and my baseboard isn't very deep, and I think they should be fairly easy to wire up. These point motors simply screw to the bottom of the board. There are 2 holes all ready for you to do that with some small screws. Then these electromagnets, when they're activated, simply pull and pull this pin left and right and therefore activate the points above. The negative about these particular motors is that you can quite easily burn them out if you throw the switch too long and keep these motors running. So with that in mind, I will be using a capacitor discharge unit just like this one. In fact, it will be this one because I built this myself. I'll stick a link on screen and in the description below showing you how I went about building this one. Needless to say, it saved me a bit of money and gave me a bit of soldering practice. So with the CDU in mind and these various point motors, of which I have 5, I also need to set up some switches. And for those, I have these tiny little on toggle switches which simply move from left to right and return to center. So you can never leave the switch hung on too long, which is perfect for these particular types of motors. I'm very much entering into the realms of electronics here, and I need to ensure that I get all of my wires and connections in the right order, coming from my controller using the 16-volt accessory socket, then coming through the CDU, which will then go via the switch and then feed the point motor. But equally, I have, as you'll see on both of these, a common return, which is in the middle or neutral, and the same applies to the switch. And then I have these, in effect, A and B terminals, which will be the same on the point motor. So the power will come into the switch, down the common, and out and around to here, and then back into the return of the CDU. That's how it should work in theory. I've been looking at the bottom of the board with cables and all of these switches and getting myself in a bit of a tiz. So I've gone back to my PC to draft it using a bit of software. I've skipped forward in time and the board is now dry. I've also got myself some more braided cable. In this case, I'm using yellow and blue, British Rail blue. And I've got my 3 key components set out in front of me. So there's a point motor hole for each one of the 5 point motors I have on the board. I'm going to run this from here because this is where the controller is going to be. I'm going to take it around and probably place the CDU here if I am following my plan. Now I do have that printed up, so I've got something that I can follow. So I shall lay that down in front of me just there. CDU coming around about here. And then I'm going to focus on probably point motor A here. It makes sense to do that. I will need to align these points and get the motor perpendicular to the travel of the line. I think the best way to do that is to get a small drill and drill holes either side. That will give me 2 holes either side of the main hole for the pin. Then I can just draw a line straight across between those 2 holes, and that will give me an orientation in which to place my motor. Before I do any of that though, I don't even know if this works. It looks well soldered, but given I haven't tested it yet, I think I might do a little bit of soldering just to make sure this is good before I start worrying about wiring everything up together. I'm ready to go. I've got all of my components. I've also got some offcuts of black and red cable. This is what was left over when I did the bus wires, and it's always worth keeping a few offcuts because you never know when you might need them. I'm going to quickly go and tin the ends of these cables and tin the various elements, and then I'm going to start to put everything together. So the next thing to do is to wire up everything together. I've got my diagram printed up as I've just mentioned. So I just need the power in. So this is going to come directly from the controller. So let me just get some cables and wire in there. Okay, that's power in from the controller. Just checking everything feels good. All my soldering previously looks good. Now I actually built this before Christmas, so 2 or 3 months ago. This was the first thing I did on camera. Never intended it to be any part of a channel. It was just something I did for fun. Let's keep going. We've got that. Then we need to bring the power out and start to wire everything together. So first things first, we need a switch. And we're going to have our power going into that. Let's get a fairly long one. And then that's going to go across to our point motors and then back again. So we'll have a nice long black one as the common return, and then a couple of red ones going either side. Hard to kind of describe on a board like this, but that's kind of how it's going to work. So power out into the middle. Depending on how you throw the switch, the power will come out and then back down the common return, the black cable. Or if I was to throw it to the left, then it will go up that way, throw the motor the other way and come back down again. I'm going to go ahead and get this soldered and hopefully things will work, but we won't know till we try. So on the back of the controller here, we obviously have our track 12 volt output and we have our 16/18 volt AC. That's the one I'm going to be connecting in now. So that looks pretty good in terms of loose screws. Let's get that in there and get everything ready to go. I am nervous. I'm more nervous now than I was when I first wired up my track. If that's wired up wrong, something will go pop. In which case I failed. I've learned something, and that is just buy them built. But if it works, I'll be super chuffed. Okay, so my assumption is I power this up. This is going to charge up. Some sort of green LED on the back here will turn on, as you can see, and then it should work. I should be able to throw the switch and move the point motor. Let's power on. Yes, I have a green LED. Now let's see what happens. I'm trying to keep everything in view. Let's see what happens. Yes! And then the light goes green when it charges. It's jumping around. And point proven, if I hold this up, we'll see this change direction, but it's not buzzing, or it's not drawing a current directly onto that motor, therefore it's protecting it. One more. And one final trick that I do love about capacitors, and I remember this from A-levels, if I disconnect the power, so there's no power running through this, the capacitors are charged, they are equivalent to batteries. You can see the green LED is on, so just a small amount of current, just enough to keep that lit, and this should fire one more time. There she goes, and that's it. That went so much better than I thought it might. There was every chance that I'd missed some solder or bridged a couple of solder gaps and this CDE was just going to go pop and not work. But it did work, so I'm really happy. The next big thing is to do it across the entire board. So I'll go and get everything aligned as I mentioned previously, make sure that all of my point motors have their orientation. I'm then going to get them fixed down because I think actually soldering on the board directly will be easier. I did use my dead man here, my little helper, and it's fine, but actually having things fixed down I think will make life a bit easier. I can then test to make sure that those are working perfectly. I could even just go around and use this to test each of the motors. But given this is actually working, I think I'm ready just to wire everything up in one go. Right, I have drilled the holes as required, and you can see a pair of them there, either side of the switch. So that means that I can translate that to the underside of the board and ensure that the point motors are in the right orientation. I've stacked the baseboard on a couple of storage boxes just to elevate it off the trestle table, because when I fit these point motors, initially the pin is way too long. Once I've got everything fitted, I can flip it all back over and then I can snip off the excess. First things first then, let's draw these lines across here as best as we can. There we go, nice and obvious. One over here. And one over here. And that really is tight, that one. You can see how close it is to the edge of the hole. But that's okay, we've tested it, it works. Now, eagle-eyed viewers will be noticing the various track pins protruding through the board. They are quite lethal, little punji sticks. I will be removing those when I come to ballasting. So everything will be glued down and it won't be so much of an issue. But for now, they're in just to keep the track in place. So let's grab my first point motor, that's everything. Do a little bit of tidying. Not too bad. Let's start with this one. Now I can see the hole. So that goes through there. Now what I do need to do is see which way the switch is orientated. I can hear it, so it's fully that way, in which case we want to make sure that the solenoid is that side. So once that's in position, it's going to do that. Sounds good. Sounds good indeed. Right, what I'm going to do is get some very small screws, I think. Unfortunately, this baseboard is only 3mm thick, so I need some very tiny screws indeed. Otherwise, I may have to glue them in place, and I don't think PVA is going to be man enough for the job. I've been to have a look in my stores, and sadly, I do not have any fixings small enough for this job. So I'm going to have to go online and order some, and hopefully they'll arrive in the next couple of days. As you can see though, I have marked out exactly where these motors need to go. So I think in the meantime, what I can do is start to get all the cables roughly in position, ready for soldering, and then I can fix these down, last knockings, when the fixings arrive. I'm going to give myself pretty much the same amount of length on the end for the controller as I had for the track. I shall bring this additional accessories wire around the corner, and then I need to bring it up and it will extend around the top of the board. Now, I haven't covered that in this episode, but there will be some lights going in some of the buildings. We have the warehouse, we have the kind of gate entrance, the pump house, and then somewhere around here, it's flipped over. So here is the signal box. So I will be running some additional lighting around here. That's part of the future plan. For now, I need to bring this in to the CDU. Where have I put the CDU? There she is, still connected from our testing earlier. Let me get this stuck down in position, then the rest of the cables can start to be positioned for the points and the switches, and we'll go from there. Right, the CDU is in position, it's been fixed down, I'm happy where it is. I've checked where the track is underneath, and if there are any pins or anything I need to remove, that should be absolutely fine where it is. I can move it, it is only stuck down. I'm now going to just bring this cable from here and into this position with a little bit of extra slack in case I need it. And then fundamentally it can go back out and run around. So for now, let me just grab my cutters. And I think I'm really going to be quite liberal with this. I'm going to almost come to there. That should be more than enough. Rather have it there in the tank if I need to add any extra later on. So that can be connected into there. And then it's a case of running the wires out to each of the switches. Switches. So switches at the moment are a bit of a conundrum because I'm not entirely sure where to put them on my board. My initial idea was to have them at the back of the board underneath the kind of hilly area. And that means that you could operate from this side with viewers looking on and you could have everything hidden. But what I realised was I would need quite a lot of clearance, in which case this small kind of hill area, which I was going to place trees and grass and maybe some sheep, suddenly becomes almost a cliff face. Now I'm happy to do that and do some plaster of Paris rocks and weather them in and make them look good, but I'm just wondering if that's a huge amount of work. Of course, the alternative is to have some form of breakout box with a male and female connector, some sort of wooden construction where everything can be separated. But my concern with that is then I've got more cables hanging off the side, two separate pieces, not really fixed together, which is a bit of a pain in terms of locating yourself around the board, but also having to move things around in transit. Are things going to get damaged? Are cables going to get pulled and wrenched apart? I don't know. I'd rather keep it on the board if possible. As things stand, I currently have 5 point motors. I'm going to have 2 switches for the lights, and that's going to be so that I can switch the engine shed separately from the rest of the lights on the layout, and those other lights will be the buildings, any street lamps or anything else. I'm also going to have some buffer lights. That's in the plan for later on. I don't know whether those will be switched though. I think they will always just come on as part of the layout. So maybe not an issue there with switches. But I think at this stage, we're looking at between 8 and 10 switches for points and lights. Oh yes, and I've got 3 tracks that I want to isolate as well. So that's another 3 switches I need to have packed into this little area. So do you think that could happen? Do you think that's a good idea to have operations from behind? I don't think I'm going to be able to see it. That's the problem. If you imagine being stood here and your hands being in, or do you think it's better to have some form of external separate breakout box to manage operations? Leave a comment below. I'm really interested. I don't know what to do yet. I haven't made a decision, but given point motors are going in, I feel like I need to make a decision fairly soon. Speaking of point motors, they are now attached to the board. Let's take a look. So it turns out that getting 3mm screws that still have a head large enough to hold these point motors down seems to be a bit of a struggle. So in the end, what I've done, and I have seen other modelers do this, is I've just put a block in place, as you can see, 5 pieces of wood. I've glued this down, these are not going anywhere, and that's given me enough headroom to get a decent sized screw in. These are just 5/8/6s, they could be even smaller. And I will have to seek out some smaller screws because I think they're going to be really useful in the future. But for now, these are working really well. As you can hear, they're latching nice and cleanly. All good. So I'm really happy with those. The next thing I need to do is get these point motors and switches wired up. But I've already showed you that previously. That process will be the same. However, I know that some of you wanted to see how I actually clipped the splicing cables together, because I did that in fast motion, or double speed last time around. So let me get a bit closer and I'll quickly show you how those work. So I have this main wire coming in from the CDU. I've placed 4 of the splicing clips on already, and I want to stick a 5th one in here. And that is simply this clip here. I've shown these before. But you can see this is where the wire sits in, and the wire needs to be the correct gauge. It's worth noting that, so that the actual contact, the physical contact, is maintained. Then that clasps around, and then we have the additional pieces which come on the trailing wires, which then clip over the top, and that is just a metal piece that then clips into this area here. So I have already used my wire tool to open up the cable. Let me just see if I can just prise that a bit further open. All I need to do at that point is slot the cable into that gap and push it down a little bit with my thumb. And that's actually really nice and tight. It's pinching that already. So I'll just make sure that's in. Then this clips over the top. And now that is secure, and in effect we've created that T-junction. So now I just need to go and get some of these, in effect, offshoots, which are additional cables where I've already put the other section on the end, and these simply just clip on the end. Now I've got one more to do, so what I'll do is just quickly connect these on so you can see how easy that is. That pushes on there, that pushes on there, one in there, and then one in there. And then I just need to do one more, and I do have a spare bit of cable, which I'll do now. So the wire simply pushes into here, and then you pinch this section down and it holds the wire securely in place. There are various different types of crimping tools on the market, but this is the sets that I'm using. And what's important to notice that we have our different crimping gauges, but actually we want to use the insulated crimper 22 to 10 gauge. It's basically just this flat area here, and it's got 3 different colors, and the individual clips are all color coded, so red, green, yellow and blue. So that's basically telling me that I can use all of those. So very carefully then, I'm just going to pop that on there. I'm just kind of pinching both between my finger, and I'm just going to grab this into that crimping area. Trying to get this cleanly on camera for you all so you can see it in there, and then give it a good old, just making sure that's kind of perpendicular, a good old squeeze down, making sure this wire stays in there. That contact needs to be in there when you're crimping. That's the important thing. A good old squeeze using all of your forearm, and that should be it. That is now tight, and I can't get that out. If I really yank that hard, it might come out, but as it is, that's a good job. The only other thing is when you crimp it, the metal contact on the inside sometimes seats itself towards the top, so you can just stick your nail in there and just gently bend that down so it's right in the middle, and that just makes life a little bit easier when you eventually come to pushing it on like that. Now I've got my 5 cables. These are all going to feed the switches. I have a bit of runoff here because I wasn't sure if I need it, and I'd rather have it here than have to solder an extra piece on. You could argue that this could actually feed the 5th and final switch, but for now I'm happy just to leave that off to the side. I'm going to go solder these on, and I'll bring you back in shortly. Soldering to the switches is complete, to varying degrees of good and bad soldering. Some of it went really well, and other ones were just very, very blobby. I think the rule of thumb is, A, I need a new soldering iron. That £5 soldering iron just isn't good enough. Secondly, getting a bit closer and just being quick and precise is the way forward. And I do remember that again from years and years and years ago when I used to do a fair bit of soldering, doing my A-levels. Wow. Right, so the next thing I need to do, if I just grab one of these up, is I need to now run the 2 terminals out to each of the switches. Because I need to give myself a lot of slack, I'm going to be using an awful lot of cable here, and I think I might even coil these up again. Yeah, I might braid them just to keep things tidy. But once I've done that, until I finally decide what I'm doing with these switches, I need to give myself a bit of slack. So full length from here to each of these switches. Yeah, I'll do that now, and then we should be in a position to give everything a test. And I know you're all looking forward to that. After some cutting and twisting and braiding, I now have 5 lengths of cable in British Rail, yellow and blue, and sadly blue and white, simply because I ran out of yellow cable. I will need to pick up some more. So 3 longer ones to feed the rear switches as you look at from this orientation, and then some shorter ones that go round and feed the front too. 4 days of inactivity have passed because this cheap £5 soldering iron finally gave up the ghost right when I needed it most. I've ordered a new one and I've managed to get everything soldered up. Let's take a look. Much progress then, as you can see on the board. Let me talk you through where we are. So, the switches, for all intents and purposes, have been wired up. I have left a couple, which I will do on camera shortly. But we have our power into our switch, we have our feeds going up to our point motor, and then coming back down the return and back out to the CDU. Point 1 and 2 are completed, as you can see, that's all wired up. Point number 3 I need to add to the switch shortly, but the actual common return has been spliced in. Then we come around to 4, which has been soldered to the switch, but I need to do the splice in here. And then last but not least, number 5 with the white cable is all complete. My combi controller is already wired up to the accessory ports. That's ready to go. I'll adjust the cameras, I'll show you these last few bits in close up, and then we'll be ready for testing. I've got my little helper with my solder ready. I've got my brand new soldering iron getting up to temperature. So while that's doing that, I'm going to start by adding this return, splicing it to the blue cable here, and then soldering onto this point motor. So just a quick cut in there, and as you can see, that's exposed the wire. I'm going to grab my clip pinch that in there and clip it in there. Now don't get confused, I may have said this previously, but red clips are for the gauge, not to match the colour of wire. So this is the smallest size, I have a single wire, so that's the size I need to use. That goes from 20 to 24 in terms of the gauge. I've got a length of blue here, which is more than enough, as you can see, so I'll just cut that down a little bit so that can go onto there. A quick snip there, and that's the piece we'll use. Expose the ends of the wire, and the second one, give that a twist, and give that end a twist. Now, as I showed you earlier, I just need to stick this in here. Quick crimp. Seeing this live, you'll be bored of seeing me crimping by the time this layout's finished. And then that is going to connect into there. Right, so the next thing is to tin this, get some solder onto the contact and get that in place. Now this new soldering iron is absolutely wonderful compared to the cheap £5 one I was using. A good workman should never blame their tools, but in this case, this has made a massive difference when completing the rest of this. Yeah, this is the tool I wanted. Temperature control, accurate tips that I can swap out, and actually having the small tip really helps when fiddling around with small contacts like this. Right. Enough waffle, let me get some solder on the end. I'm going to try and do this without getting my head in the way of the camera. I've already got a tiny bit of flux on the end of the wire here. Let's get that up to temperature. Lovely. I've already tinned this one. Let's just get into position. It's going to be hard for you to see. Bit of extra solder on the end of your soldering iron really makes a big difference. It gives you a lot of extra surface area, which means the contact that you make between the wire and the strip is much better rather than just using a dry tip. So that's a good bit of advice that I've been reminded of by one of my commenters. So thank you very much. You know who you are. Onto there, remove, and that's done. A lovely clean solder joint. Really do recommend buying a decent soldering iron. Right, let's move on. So the next one I want to look at is this final motor, which is motor number 3. I just need to connect up these two wires onto the switch. So I'm just going to tin the ends. That's one. There we go, there's a second. So I've left myself the most difficult one last because this was the switch that I used in my small testing, and so it's got a bit of solder still on there. Just make sure that is relatively in focus for you guys. Right, so I think I will start with, let's come this side for this one. Get a bit of solder on the tip, as I said, increase that surface area. Dropping it down on the motor. And let's get some temperature in there. That one's done. That is a horrible, horrible solder joint. It really is. Please don't rate my soldering because it is, it's terrible. Okay, ready for the last one. It's actually very difficult doing this on camera because I'm actually nowhere near where I'd want to be. Okay, that one's got it. I think that will do. Right, let's get some power onto the board and hope that these switches all work. Okay, it's the moment of truth. I've got my controller and I've got my power cable. So let's connect that up. The green LED is lit and let's try these point motors. So keep an eye, I'm going to be going for point number 1 first, which is this cable here. And hopefully we'll hear a nice click. Yes, there we go. Number 1 works. Number 2, and I haven't tested this beforehand. Ouch, quite a lot of solder on that one. Number 2, yes. Wonderful. Number 3, which is this one, the one we've literally just soldered live on the recording. Here we go. That's working. And then we come down to number 4, which we just completed earlier as well. Let's have a look. Brilliant. And then last but not least, number 5 with the blue and white. Wonderful. It works. That was an epic session. Taken me about 10 days with various delays due to soldering and being busy at work. But I think I've got there in the end. I'm really happy. I suppose the next thing I need to do is flip it over and see that the points are actually working, because this side only shows me that the motors are working. But if those tracks are not throwing properly, then I may have to do some minor adjustments. Fingers crossed, everyone. Let's flip the board over. All the wires are poking through nicely and everything looks good. Right, let's just get reconnected on the controller. And this is back to the conversation I was having earlier. So please do let me know about how I might deal with a mountain or some sort of switch area. I think maybe a flat board now. I'm thinking about it, maybe angled. And then the kind of hill area on the back of that. I think that could work. Anyway, let's get this tested. I'm not sure which does which now. It was in reverse. So this should be number 5, but it's actually now number 1. Okay, never mind. Let's see how we get on. I think we've got power. And there we go. That is throwing. Lovely. I do need to tack this down. Behind the scenes, I had to lift quite a bit of track that I tacked down previously because I had to make some adjustments to get these point motors just in the right place. So yes, I can't reiterate enough how annoying it is if you've over-tacked, which I had. But that's good, that was working. Okay, let's just pick the next one randomly. Let's see which one this is. Okay, that's up there and that is throwing very well indeed. Oh, where's that? That's this one here. Very good. Then we are down to this one, which I'm guessing will be that one, maybe? No, it's this one here. Yes, and then that should be the last one at the end here. Super job. I'm wondering whether or not I need to just cut off these extra side pieces because they're not going to be in use. And once we've ballasted, then these are going to be getting in the way of the stones. But I'm really happy with that. Well, I hope you've all enjoyed this episode. This has been a big one for me in terms of production and recording. It's taken a while, but I think it's come together really well. I've now got the layout working. I've got the point motors. So what I consider to be the core electronics are now in place. There are a few more electrics to deal with in terms of light and maybe isolating track down the road. But for now, I'm going to take a break. And I think the next thing I want to look at is some scenery work. Hit subscribe and tinkle that bell to be notified of the next episode where I will be weathering the track and adding some buffer stops. I'll also be adding some red LEDs to those buffer stops to add an extra level of realism. I hope you're all enjoying these videos. Please give it a like if you do and leave a comment down below. Let me know your thoughts, especially on this switch area at the back of the layout. But until then, I'll see you all very soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.